Oh, I'm waiting for him to turn the mic on. Well, good evening. Welcome to Congregation Beth Shalom. We're really delighted that all of you would come out on this cold, wintry night, but I think all of you realize what an important subject this is that we need to discuss this evening. I was brought into this discussion probably over a year ago about what was going on, particularly here at Napa Unified School District, and with the entire ethnics curriculum that the state had required be integrated into the high school program. And I've been fortunate to be able to meet with many organizations that are working, Jewish organizations, of course, that are working on this particular issue and have concerns about where the state is going and some of the things that are occurring. I think we're really lucky tonight to find Dr. Michael Harris to speak with us on this subject. Michael has been working with Stand With Us for quite some time. He is one of the founders of San Francisco Voice for Israel and serves as a lay leader with Stand With Us. Michael is very knowledgeable on this subject and has very significant presentation that I think you will find both educational and concerning. And rather than give a very long introduction on Dr. Harris, I think it's more important that we hear from Dr. Harris on this particular subject so that we can all have a clear understanding of what's going on in the state of California. And we are going to leave time for question and answer. So after the presentation, we will be taking the questions, and hopefully we can come up or have the answers that will at least give you a comfort level with what's being done and still what needs to be done. So, Michael, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the warm welcome, Ellen, and thank you to the rabbi and to Lauren Schneider and everybody who helped, make this evening possible. And thanks to all of you for coming out. And this is a really important topic. And as I'm going to talk tonight, I really want you to think about three questions. One is, what is ethnic studies anyway? What are we talking about? What is this entirely new issue that we did not have way back in the age of the dinosaurs for most of us when we went to high school? What is happening with it in our public schools? And of course, how does this affect our Jewish community? So the story in California more recently within the public schools with ethnic studies began in 2016. And there was legislation that really seemed relatively innocuous at the time that was passed that directed the Department of Education to create a model curriculum in ethnic studies. Now, model curricula at the state level are relatively standard. They have them for math, they have them for history, so this in itself was not an unusual thing. And the language of the legislation said, with the objective of preparing pupils to be global citizens with the appreciation of multiple cultures. Sounds not only innocuous, but very appropriate in this modern era, in this incredibly diverse state, right? So in 2019, 3 years later, the first draft of the state ethnic studies model curriculum was published, and it created an immediate firestorm. Next slide. Always get some technical issues going on here. There we go. So the draft was introduced, and it included language saying that its purpose was to critique empire and its relationship to white supremacy, racism, patriarchy, cis-heteropatriarchy, capitalism, and of course, you can see this talking about other forms of power and oppression at the intersections of our society. But wait, there's more. It had 500 pages in which Jews were mentioned 3 times, none of them favorably. Arab Americans, however, had 25% of the curriculum devoted to them, with a very significant portion of that devoted to the Palestinian cause. It praised figures such as Linda Sarsour, one of the co-leaders of the Women's March, and Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, both of whom have a history of having made multiple anti-Semitic statements. Its glossary defined BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, which sets as its goal the elimination of Israel as the state of the Jewish people, as a global social movement that currently aims to establish freedom for Palestinians living under apartheid conditions. In terms of being representative of California's demographics, there are more Jews of Persian origin in Los Angeles County alone, just the Persian Jews, than there are Palestinian Americans in the entire state of California. Now, the curriculum had a full list of various hatreds against minority groups in California. It did not include anti-Semitism. But two groups were heralded in the model curriculum as African American spiritual and religious traditions worthy of study. One is the Nation of Islam, headed by Louis Farrakhan, who was called Judaism a gutter religion and the synagogue of Satan. And the other one, Black Hebrew Israelites, mirrors Farrakhan's hate against Jews. The latter group you may remember from their involvement in the mass murders 3 years ago this month in Jersey City, New Jersey. And of course now their teachings have been popularized further by celebrities such as Kanye West and Kyrie Irving. Both of those groups are designated as hate groups by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So you have to wonder, how did this happen? And to understand this, you have to understand the history of ethnic studies. So ethnic studies came out of the 1960s civil rights movement. It was, in part, a revolt against what truly was Eurocentric teaching of history in the schools. You learned all about stuff that happened in Europe with white Europeans, and people who were black and brown did not see themselves reflected in history curricula. So the movement against this really came in and was centered at San Francisco State University in the 1969 student strike with the Third World Liberation Front, really led by the Black Panthers. This was not really an entirely peaceful protest. There were bombs on campus and other episodes of violence. But this particular issue centered around a demand that the university create ethnic studies courses that studied what were called the four foundational groups: Blacks, Native Americans, Hispanics, and Asian Americans. And at the time, Asian Americans referred to East Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, Filipino Americans. And that, in and of itself, led to the establishment of San Francisco State's College of Ethnic Studies. Now, what's important to understand is that when this was established, this fell within a discipline that became known as critical ethnic studies. There is a different form of ethnic studies called multicultural ethnic studies. Now, the lines between them are not absolute. There is plenty of overlap in there. But critical ethnic studies focuses on those four foundational groups. It teaches in a victim-oppressor model, that you either are a victim of racism or you are collaborating with it, and therefore you are an oppressor. Critical ethnic studies, as we will get to, supports BDS and demonizes Israel, and it really teaches a one-sided politicized approach, as opposed to the alternative of multicultural ethnic studies, which really talks about the various groups within California's diversity, challenges and contributions of each, and critical thinking in that paradigm really means more developing your own opinions based on the evidence. And unfortunately, the political agenda of critical ethnic studies is very, very clear. The San Francisco State University College of Ethnic Studies describes itself as a place to practice theories of resistance and liberation to eliminate racism and other forms of oppression. Now, all of us should be in favor of eliminating racism and other forms of oppression, but when they get into resistance and liberation, you will see what this means as we go on a little bit. And it also does come straight out of the Marxist liberation theory that the Soviet Union was promoting at the time. The former dean of the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State, Kenneth Montero, said it's not ethnic studies if it doesn't challenge whiteness, and then goes on to say we actually prepare our teachers to know that on the first day of class or in the first week, you may have students who are sobbing. This is the first time they've had to be this uncomfortable. This was not stated as a criticism. Now, if you look at their professional organization, the Critical Ethnic Studies Association, it's an academic association like there are, of course, in many, many other fields. And they founded themselves to develop an approach to scholarship and activism animated by the spirit of decolonial, anti-racist, and other global liberationist movements. And as it goes on, you see the exact same language that appeared in the first draft of the Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum. This was something written by a professor at San Francisco State named Alison Tintiago-Cubalas. She co-chaired the committee that wrote the first draft. And she talks about concerted efforts and collectivized resistance to U.S. imperialism approaches for dismantling the neo-colonial schooling apparatus. And what's important to understand is that for these folks, this is not just jargon. They are very, very serious and genuine about this type of language. Now, at this point, some of you are probably wondering about the connection between critical ethnic studies and what you've heard a lot about in the news, which is critical race theory. They are aligned, but critical race theory didn't come along until the late 1980s as a legal theory being taught in universities and law schools. And as we just saw, critical ethnic studies actually started back in the late 1960s, early 1970s. But we are going to get into detail on that. Now, how does all of this lead to Israel, Zionism, and promoting the BDS movement becoming part of a course on ethnicity in America? Zionism, of course, being simply supporting the existence of Israel as the state of the Jewish people in a portion of the Jewish indigenous homeland, and of course, anti-Zionism being the opposite, advocating for the elimination of Israel as the state of the Jewish people. Anti-Zionism is no more criticism of Israel any more than Vladimir Putin is just being critical of Ukraine. Now, because critical ethnic studies looks at everything through the lens of power dynamics, with the oppressor-oppressed model where the stronger party is pretty much automatically considered the oppressor, they ignore anti-Semitism, because Jews as a group have political power and therefore not only must be part of the oppressor class, but we as Jews cannot be considered as being victimized by racism within this model. And then they make a fundamental category error of viewing Israeli Jews as white European colonizers and Palestinians as indigenous brown people. Just don't ask how Islam and Arabic spread from the Arabian Peninsula across the Middle East and North Africa. Spoiler alert, power and oppression had a great deal to do with that. So, critical ethnic studies aligned with anti-Zionism from the outset. All 13 members of their founding board signed petitions endorsing BDS. They passed a resolution on academic boycott of Israeli academic institutions, and the past 4 conferences each had multiple sessions condemning Israel and promoting BDS. And here's a few photos from the classroom of a woman named Samia Showman, who was one of the other members of the committee that wrote this first draft. This was in her public high school in San Mateo. That's a giant Palestinian flag on the wall. This was her social studies class. Now, can you imagine if a Jewish teacher would put up a giant Israeli flag in a public school class and what the response might be? So, what happened after this draft came out? Well, Jewish organizations across the state mobilized against it. Stand With Us, ADL, Jemena, Jews Indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa, AJC, Israeli American Coalition, and others. And so at the end of July 2019, the Legislative Jewish Caucus, which is the group comprised of every Jewish member of the state legislature, as well as some who are connected through spouses, every single member signed this letter saying that the exclusion of Jews appeared to be intentional and reflected the political bias of the drafters of the model curriculum. That exclusion is deeply insulting, fundamentally inconsistent with the purposes of ethnic studies, harmful to Jewish and non-Jewish students, and indicative of an anti-Jewish bias in the ethnic studies model curriculum. Linda Darling-Hammond, the president of the State Board of Education, said the draft model curriculum falls short and needs to be substantially redesigned. And Governor Newsom called it deeply offensive in so many ways and vowed that it would never see the light of day. I want you to remember those words. So a number of things happened at this point. There were 18,000 comments received by the State Board of Education against the draft, again, thanks to all the activism done by all the Jewish community groups. The original text was discarded, the writers were let go, and it was sent back to the Department of Education to say, try again. Meanwhile, the original writers of this dissociated themselves from the project. They said, well, if you're not going to take what we wrote, we don't want to have our names on this. And they formed a group called the Save Ethnic Studies Coalition. And they made it very clear what they intended to keep the focus on the 4 foundational groups, but, and this is a big but, now including Arabs under Asian, but not including any other groups indigenous to the Middle East. So is the Middle East in Asia? Yes, geographically, yes. But they said, we're going to take just this one group indigenous to the Middle East, and we're going to ignore the rest of them. This was a statement made by a woman named Lupe Cardona, who's a professor at one of the Cal State universities. This was at a teacher training panel that they held at Fresno State University. We need to liberate ethnic studies. We want to make sure we do not eliminate the Arab American and Palestinian voice in any manner. Another one, Teresa Montano, who's a professor at Cal State Northridge. She was also one of the drafters of this, the first draft. So this is what sets them off, the boycott sanctions movement for Palestine. So then we started to say, wait a minute, who gets to define what ethnic studies is? Are we going to allow others to define what our curriculum is, or are we going to be able to say we own it, it's our perspective, it's our curriculum, we get to decide what goes in it? Now, you have to understand, these are the academics who teach ethnic studies at the university level. And so they are saying, we're the ones who created this discipline, we should be the ones to say what goes in it. So you can see, at least as far as that part of it, that they felt that they should have been the ones to have the final say on this. So what this group did over the spring and summer of 2020, after the first draft was withdrawn, they went around to various boards of education within California and asked them to pass a resolution endorsing that first draft. Now, at that point in time, not only had the state sent it back for further work in the Department of Education, you could not find this first draft on the Department of Education website anymore. They had literally pulled it down. So in many cases, school board members voted on something that they had not read and might not have known about the controversy at the state level. And here's what's really dangerous. They framed the opposition to their draft as right-wing Jews versus people of color. And they very explicitly did that in front of multiple school boards. Now, over a dozen school boards did end up passing resolutions in favor of this. So here's what did play out. That fortunately didn't have any actual effect on things in the Department of Education. State went through 3 subsequent drafts until final adoption in spring of 2021, so basically about a year and a half ago. The final draft included not 1, but 2 units on American Jewish history. One was provided by the San Francisco JCRC, and the other one was provided by Jemena, Jews indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa. What's important about the Jemena curriculum that's in there is that it included what is called the IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Association, definition of anti-Semitism. And that's the definition that's now endorsed by over 36 democracies worldwide, 27 US states, the US Department of Education, the US Department of State, and many of our own community organizations, including ADL and AJC. And it's very valuable. Not only do we feel, of course, it's appropriate if you're studying ethnicities in California to include us, but putting in education about Jews and anti-Semitism also helps provide a firewall against teachers teaching anti-Semitic content. Now, some people would say, well, what about just having, Jewish history under world history? And we already teach about the Holocaust, so why do we need that? The Holocaust doesn't tell the story of the majority of Jewish Americans any more than telling the story of the Spanish conquest of Latin America tells the story of today's Hispanic Americans. Plus, teaching just Holocaust studies completely omits the story of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. So legislation, after the final draft was adopted, legislation was signed to make ethnic studies mandatory to be offered by 2025 and mandatory for graduation by 2030 if funded by the state. Now, there were some provisions in the final legislation, which was Assembly Bill 101, so you may hear people refer to AB 101. There were some provisions that were collectively referred to as guardrails. And unfortunately, they are not as robust as would be ideal. Mostly what these guardrails do is restate protections that are already in the state education code. And this exists in the California Education Code, that the state or any governing board should not adopt any instructional materials that contain any matter reflecting adversely upon persons on the basis of race or ethnicity, gender, religion, disability, nationality, or sexual orientation. So that's all very good. But all of you who have or have had high school students, you understand that the only way you as a parent find out if inappropriate material is being taught is if your teen student comes to you and tells you, or you are doing some oversight and you find out. And the only way to remedy this is to file a complaint with the school. So again, all of you who have or have had teens in school know that it's a really high bar to get your teenager to go along with the idea that he or she or you is going to file a complaint against a teacher in whose class your student is currently, okay? So that can be very, very intimidating for a lot of teens, okay? But this is the only type of oversight that we have on what is in the curriculum, and this is really the only remedy we have for it to find out, what's going on. Meanwhile, what was the other side doing? Well, the Save Ethnic Studies led in 2021 to the formation of a group that called themselves the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Coalition to write their own version and then sell it to school districts inside and even outside California. And there was an aligned group that was part of this called Save Arab American Studies. And they promoted an online event. This was a web event that took place about 1.5 years ago. Their keynote speaker was Angela Davis, who has a long, long record of anti-Israel activism. And let me go back a little bit. There were authors of the first draft, aligned with critical ethnic studies. And before we get to that graphic, I just want to show you this. This is a teacher training session they ran in California. So they talk about this. In Palestine, the people who are attempting to maintain systems of oppression and racial domination are sharing ideology, strategy, and weapons. For example, police strategies have been transnationalized, with the U.S. and Israeli Police Department exchanging tactics. This is essentially a blood libel against Israel, claiming that Israel is teaching U.S. police how to oppress black and brown people, okay? When in fact, what these exchange programs are really about anti-terror tactics and about how to be able to help preserve and save civilian life when you are acting against terrorists. This came directly out of a campaign by Jewish Voice for Peace, which is nominally Jewish and not really very much for peace, which they called Deadly Exchange. So this came directly out of there. This was the graphic I was starting to talk about. Look at the words here. Zionists have no place in the classroom, okay? Are they talking students? Are they talking teachers? What kind of testing are we going to do to filter out Zionists from being in the classroom? This is in America in this decade, okay? And think about how brazenly they say this, realizing how many school administrators will not push back against their use of this type of language. And when Liberated Ethnic Studies launched their website, this was the very, very first section that they put up. Not anything about Black Americans, not anything about Hispanic Americans. And you can make a very good case. Blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, and Asian Americans have been far disproportionately the recipients and suffering from the legacies of racism in this country. There's a really good case to be made for that. then why is it that the first pages they put up are Teaching Palestine, a toolkit? And they've now since made these pages not easy to find. They haven't taken them down, but they've hidden them. Fortunately, the Internet Wayback Machine lets us be able to view them. And here's one of these pages. And the second paragraph. Zionism is a nationalist colonial ideology that from the late 19th century on has called for the creation and expansion of Israel as a Jewish state in historic Palestine by any means necessary. And then they go on to talk about Israel's apartheid policies and Zionist organizations trying to silence discussion. And at the bottom, they call out specifically 3 organizations: the ADL, the San Francisco JCRC, and the Simone Wiesenthal Museum of Tolerance. Okay? They go on to say elsewhere on these pages, Zionist organizations, their primary goal is to stunt the development of authentic anti-racist curriculum. Goes back to the same theme that they were bringing in front of school boards. And now I did promise to talk about critical ethnic studies and critical race theory. And people are saying, oh, but nobody's teaching critical race theory in high schools. They are absolutely teaching critical race theory in high schools. You can go online and look for the Tam Union High School District, which is the largest district in Marin County, where I used to live. And I give Tam Union High great credit for being completely transparent in terms of their curriculum, okay? Their ethnic studies course is online. The very first page, students will understand the tenets of critical race theory, and they have readings from critical race theory. So yes, it's being taught. And this is from Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, Demystifying CRT, Teaching Critical Race Theory in K through 12 Classrooms, okay? Again, they're not talking just high schools. They're talking K through 12. They're talking some children who are younger than your Hebrew school students here at Congregation Beth Shalom, okay? And even if they are not teaching CRT directly, they're not necessarily having students read Derek Bell or Kimberly Crenshaw, who are 2 of the primary founders of CRT. They teach through the ideological lens of CRT, and this is really important to understand. It says that racism is not merely individual bias or prejudice, but something embedded in society at every level, legal, educational, and cultural. Okay, there is a case to be made for that. But it goes on to say that all inequalities in society must be considered to be the result of systemic racism and only the result of systemic racism. So that any group who has disproportionate success in America compared to the mean must therefore be a beneficiary of racism. Now, think about not only the Jewish community in that regard, but the Chinese American community, the Korean American community, the Hindu American community. They are telling all of those communities that their success is solely and uniquely due to systemic racism in society. And how much is ethnic studies tied into this worldview? Well, this is the national group now, the Coalition for Liberated Ethnic Studies. And what you can see highlighted here, this is one of their points of unity. Teachers, schools, and school districts should understand the importance of authentic ethnic studies, have sufficient support to withstand attacks from Zionist and other right-wing forces. Note that all Zionists here, by their definition, are right-wing. And liberalism, so liberalism isn't any good with them either, including attacks on critical race theory, which is central to ethnic studies as a discipline. I'm not saying that that's what they're teaching. They are saying that's what they're teaching. Note also the last line here, that another point of unity is that educational institutions do not use the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism or any other definitions that equate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. Now, this is the text of the IHRA. And what's highlighted is, however, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be considered as anti-Semitic. So the only way that you can say that the IHRA considers all criticism of Israel to be anti-Semitic is you're either illiterate or you're gaslighting. And I don't think that these people who have PhDs and academic appointments are illiterate. Think about the breathtaking hypocrisy that's required to insist that only people who have experienced oppression have the qualifications and the insight to articulate that oppression and to define it for the rest of society, except when it comes to Jews. That the definition that we as a community use is not acceptable, and they are going to speak over us. There's a British Jewish, actually, comedian by trade named David Baddiel. He just wrote a book last year called Jews Don't Count. He just did a 1-hour documentary, which is available online, and I would highly recommend. I watched it last week. It's very, very much worth watching. That in any of these issues of racism, oppression, where we don't want to be seen primarily as victims, but we want to acknowledge the anti-Semitism that exists, the standards for treating anti-Jewish hatred the same as other hatreds are somehow markedly different. Now, I do want to get a little bit editorial. There are many people who oppose CRT because of the ideological underpinnings that I've just shown you. There are also many people who take any teaching about the history and the current problems of racism in this country, and they label it as CRT. In Alabama, earlier this year in February, the state superintendent of education was receiving complaints that marking Black History Month was CRT. And you might remember the controversy last year in Texas when the legislature passed a law that said you have to teach both sides of every issue. And one local school district decided that, well, to comply with the law, they would have to teach both sides of the Holocaust. The CRT and critical ethnic studies proponents want nothing better than to lump us together with people who take a far more extreme position and use far more extreme language about this. I don't think we should be making it easy for them. I am very much in favor of teaching in an age-appropriate, grade-appropriate manner about the past and present problems with racism in America, including anti-Semitism. Last year, you may remember that the Biden administration marked the 100th anniversary of the race riots, which were essentially a pogrom against blacks in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I learned a lot about that event, and I was stunned that I really didn't know about it earlier. And I consider myself very, very well-read in history. So this is just another example of why we do need to be teaching our students about this. So my advice is, don't even get into CRT. Don't get into the culture wars. Talk about anti-Semitism in the curriculum and why it has no place there. Teaching about racism is not and should not be negotiable. We cannot ally with those who oppose CRT because they don't want any teaching about racism or even any books by minority authors in the schools. We cannot stand with those people. We do not want to stand with those people. And at the same time, we refuse to have the Jewish community thrown under the bus in this effort. Many of you are probably familiar with the saying of several hundred years ago, Reb Nachman of Breslov, Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tzama od. The whole world is a narrow bridge, and this issue is a very, very narrow bridge that we need to navigate. Now, let's talk about your school district here in Napa. Most of you remember this from 6 months ago. This is the two headlines from Jay Weekly within a few days of each other, that the school's okay to contract with liberated ethnic studies, and then next week it was announced that they weren't. So they have not contracted with liberated ethnic studies. Instead, your school district has contracted for professional development for ethnic studies with Dr. Dale Allender from Sacramento. Phew, problem solved, right? Not quite. This is the rest of that webpage from Dr. Dale Allender, and look what he endorses, the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum. The same people whose top priority was developing their Teach Palestine toolkit. Now, we know from other districts that LESMC charges $1,700 an hour for teacher training. So not only are these liberated ethnic studies proponents true believers, they believe probably correctly that they are sitting on a gold mine. There's a lot of money available for this. This is the information I have, and I know we have a school board member from Napa Valley Unified School District here today, so if this is incorrect, I would be happy to be corrected on this, but that there's $250,000 from the state specifically earmarked for ethnic studies, and that there's a $5 million grant under what's called community schools, which can also be used for a number of things, but one of them could be ethnic studies. At the same time, your school board made a presentation at a recent meeting of the California School Boards Association of how to deal with staffing cuts at a time of declining enrollment. So the question is, how much should this program be a priority for the district, given that there are less expensive and far less controversial options available? One article I have up here, and I only have a limited number of copies, but for those of you who are interested in pursuing this further, it's an article that was published just a few months ago by Bill Honig. For those of you who don't know who Bill Honig is, he is the former state superintendent of public instruction for the state of California. And he wrote this very, very well-written piece on California schools should opt for inclusive ethnic studies. And again, that's in opposition to the critical ethnic studies. Basically, when people use the term inclusive ethnic studies, it's more or less the same as the multicultural ethnic studies that I was showing you before. And this is an article that I think should be in front of every school board member in the entire state of California, because Bill Honig is extremely experienced, very well respected in the field, and this article should carry a lot of weight. Now, what do the Liberated folks have in mind? Well, they want to make this go national. As you saw, there's the National Coalition for Ethnic Studies. And they have definitely recruited the teachers' unions nationally to help push for this. So, no talk like this is complete without a what can I do slide. So, this is from the Stand With Us Ethnic Studies Toolkit webpage. You don't have to bother writing down that URL on the bottom. You just Google Stand With Us Ethnic Studies Toolkit. It will take you right to this. And note the 3 questions that you want to have in mind when you're looking at any curriculum. Does it keep anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-Semitic bias out of ethnic studies courses? Does it include accurate and constructive education about Jews and anti-Semitism? And does it have strong guidelines about fostering critical thinking and not promoting one-sided political agendas or advocacy of any kind in the classroom? And even if you do not have children in the school district now, you're stakeholders. You vote here, you pay taxes here, you are a stakeholder in the school system. So I hope I've answered the first 2 questions for you. What is ethnic studies and what's happening in the public schools? Now, the last one, how can this affect our Jewish community? Einat Wilf, who is the scintillatingly brilliant Israeli writer and speaker, she notes that regardless of whether one believes that anti-Zionism is indeed anti-Semitism, now I certainly do to the core of my being, other people may differ, regardless of how you feel on that, there is a historical truth that when an organization adopts anti-Zionism as a policy, 3 things happen. The environment becomes inhospitable to Jews, the Jews leave, and the organization, the entity, is worse off for it. Think about not only the former Soviet Union and the Arab states in the 20th century, when anti-Zionism was official government policy, but also think about organizations such as the British Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, or the Women's March under the leadership of Linda Sarsour. And this is what anti-Zionism looks like on the streets. This was a map that was handed out at an anti-Israel rally in New York in March of this year. Globalize the Intifada. Remember that the Intifada was a 5-year terror war aimed at Israeli civilians. 80% of the casualties were women, children, and seniors. Over 1,000 were killed, thousands more were wounded. There's a similar effort called the Boston Mapping Project, which highlighted the addresses of the Boston chapters of the ADL, JCRC, and American Jewish Committee, among others.
In the words of the Boston Mapping Project, we have shown physical addresses, named officers and leaders, and mapped connection. These entities exist in the physical world and can be disrupted in the physical world. We hope people will use our map to help figure out how to push back effectively. So it's a pretty clear message. Zionism is committing genocide and ethnic cleansing. Here are organizations that support Zionism, and they need to be disrupted. And this is what anti-Zionism looked like on the streets of Los Angeles in May of 2021, while Hamas was launching missiles at Israeli cities. We are seeing more anti-Semitism now than at any time in recent decades, thanks to people like Kanye, Kyrie, and the ability of social media to magnify their hate. We have right-wing neo-Nazi anti-Semitism. We have left-wing progressive anti-Semitism. We have anti-Semitism from Islamist groups. And it's becoming normalized. Not only a former president having dinner with anti-Semites and Holocaust deniers, but the person who led the rally at which that globalized the Intifada map was handed out was given just 2 months later the honor of being the commencement speaker at the City University of New York Law School. But what we haven't had here yet in modern America is governmental promotion of anti-Semitism. And that's what a school district adopting a curriculum with anti-Semitic elements is. It's government endorsement and promotion of anti-Semitism. And if you think the environment on university campuses is challenging for Jews now, wait until significant numbers of students arrive, having taken courses at age 14 or even younger, telling them that Israel is an illegitimate settler colonial state committing genocide and practicing apartheid, and that its supporters are not only all right-wingers, but are also aligned with white supremacists. That's the future that liberated ethnic studies is working very hard to create. And it's up to us, for our sake, and for the sake of our children and grandchildren, that we do not allow this to happen. Now, before I take questions, I would like to introduce someone who will say a few words. Johanna, you can come on up. Johanna Meckel is someone who I've worked with and stand with us for a number of years. She is a resident of Napa. She has a very personal stake in this, and so I'd like to have her talk before we go to the Q&A.
Thanks. So I haven't spoken since...
Here, Joe, you should put this on.
Oh, okay.
So people online can hear you.
It's very professional. Yeah. Okay. So I haven't spoken to audiences since before my daughter was born, 4 years ago. So excuse me, this is fresh for me. So I know some of you, but for those I don't, I'm Johanna Meckel. I used to be the director for Stand With Us in Northern California. I've lived in Napa for about 9 years now. I have 2 children. One of which will be starting in the Napa Valley Unified School District this coming fall. I'm originally from Los Angeles. My father is a child of Holocaust survivors. My mother is Israeli from Moroccan immigrants. The idea of never again was very big for us in our home. This was an idea that we talked about a lot. I knew that people at one point hated us, but I was like, that's in the past. That's not something that we need to deal with anymore. Until I went to college. I went to University of California, Santa Cruz in 2006. One of the first experiences I had, I was passing out flyers to invite people for a Shabbat dinner. Nothing to do with Israel. And I had somebody come and feel my head for horns. In 2006, in California, at a liberal university, I had someone feel my head for horns in 2006. It only increased from there. The anti-Semitism I felt was horrendous. I was called a Nazi more times than I can remember, the very people who killed half my family. I was called a baby killer many times. I was called an oppressor. You name it, I was called it. I've been walked to my car multiple times by security. When I graduated from Santa Cruz, I decided that this is something I wanted to take on. My plan was to go to law school. I thought that's what my next step was, and I realized that this was where my heart was. I worked for Stand With Us as their Pacific Northwest campus coordinator. So I worked on every university campus from Monterey Bay up through the Western Canada. The stuff that I experienced on those campuses only got worse every year. students were being asked what their Jewish agenda was when they were trying to get onto student councils. This is crazy. This is not something that our students should be dealing with. So after I worked on college campuses, I realized that what I really wanted to do was work with where the issues were beginning, in the home. So I decided I started the chapter in Northern California, thanks to Mike, as the director in Northern California, working with synagogues, working with parents. Unfortunately, there was way more work than I could accomplish before having my first child. So I'm still working part-time, but now Mike, now he's retired, fortunately, he'll be able to do a little bit more. So our Holocaust generation is quickly disappearing, and with them, their stories. So when I was working on the college campuses, some of our students were born the year of 9/11 in 2001. The idea of 9/11 was completely far for them. You know, it's a place, it happened really far, it was a long time ago, they felt nothing toward it. So you can imagine how they felt about the Holocaust. It's a story, you know, that was told to them, you know, in Hebrew school that they weren't even paying attention to. This is not something that can happen again. Never again doesn't mean anything to them. And certainly not their peers, who are not even being educated about this at all. So I know a lot of people think, you know, I'm an alarmist because I get really nervous when I hear about all these anti-Semitic acts that are occurring. I think the New York Police Department just published a report saying that anti-Semitic incidents are up 125% in the last year, right? That's insanity. What year is this? This is not something that our children and our grandchildren should be dealing with. I'm no longer worried about my safety, I'm worried about my children's safety. I didn't give my children Jewish names on purpose. This is a big issue. And if this is something that you're wanting to work on and help us with, please come and speak to Mike and I afterward if you have any questions that you might not want to ask publicly. We're here and we want to help. I'm local. This is a very big issue for me. So thank you, Ellen, for helping to organize tonight. And yeah, please, any questions you might have.
Hot mic. Michael, are you ready to take some questions?
Absolutely.
All right. Are there any burning questions that anybody wants to ask? Well, since no one has anything burning, I'm going to ask a couple questions.
Go right ahead.
Here in Napa, and I know Cindy's here, what can we do locally to inform our school board members of what's really going on? Because I have to believe that they innocently voted for this. And maybe, Cindy, you can address that, because I know that the vote was unanimous for the first go-around, except for one member. Right. Cindy, can I put you on the spot and ask you?
Yeah, and by the way, Lisa Chu is here as well. She's also on the board. I do have a question, though, for Joanna. Okay, how did it happen? We have administrators in charge of secondary ed, who, by the way, are much more conservative than I am, and went through and chose a group. And incidentally, all of these things that you see that you showed us, they're not readily available. They're not easy to find, and they recommended them. But we had a difference of opinion relating to a personnel issue earlier, a couple of years earlier, and we sort of had a mutual breakup. They don't want to work with us. We don't want to work with them. It's a convoluted story, but both of us decided that it wasn't working out. And yes, we have hired Dr. Dale Allender, who wrote the textbook for the UC that UC Berkeley uses for the course you took, because ethnic studies is a required course at UC Berkeley. And We are going to be discussing it tomorrow at our meeting tomorrow, so you can tune in tomorrow night. Materials are going to be made available, and we will probably, we are scheduled to adopt the materials on January 19th, our meeting on January 19th. Now, the thing with liberated ethnic studies, we didn't have a curriculum. They were simply going to be consultants. We were going to devise our own curriculum. And certainly it wasn't going to have anything to do with anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism. That was not going, we have no intention of including that. Because, well, I'm a member of the synagogue. This is my husband, Neil Water. And we are certainly aware of, I taught at Napa High School for 15 years. I've lived here for 32 years. I moved here shortly after the Aryan Woodstock was held out at Jameson Canyon. That's an event that some of you, might remember who were here longer. Last year, I walked out on my street and saw it littered with leaflets blaming the Jews for everything evil under the sun. In fact, I never realized that Joe Biden was Jewish, but apparently he is, according to this leaflet. When I called the police up, I mean, they were everywhere. They were thrown everywhere. And I was, not frightened, but furious. And the police officer was quoted as saying, well, really, this is no different from having something, from the post office land on your doorstep. He walked that one back, and they were doing a little bit of public relations regrooving. The individual who threw these around, the reporter from the Press Democrat, tracked him down. He lives in Petaluma. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you know what else happened? Did you hear that he went to a death camp in Eastern Europe and was passing out? He went to Auschwitz. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
You got that? And he's planning on going to Florida?
Right.
Great. Okay, so what I'm saying is, we do have a lot of anti-Semitism in this community, but it's not at our school district. And the school district is globalize the Intifada zone of operations. It's strange. I just can't conceive of how that's linked to an ethnic studies program that is a state requirement. We are planning on running a sort of a pilot program elective next year in the fall, so we can have everything tuned up. We're going to be running it 2 years earlier, before the so that our class of 2028 will have it. It's statewide. It's for 2030. But I think obviously liberated ethnic studies has some people on it that are a little overwrought, but none of this material was presented to our school district.
Right, and this is a very important point, by the way, to understand that, again, this is not material that school board members may be aware of. This is true, across the entire state. And this is why, we are trying to get the word out, not just, here in Napa, but across the state, to let our community know that this is information that their school board members may absolutely not be aware of. And again, I'm not worried that they're going to sneak in some globalize the Intifada stuff under you, but if you go back to the slide, with Dr. Allender endorsing liberated ethnic studies, the same people who decided their top priority is Teach Palestine, and the same people who call out Jewish community organizations, that is a big concern in a time of rising and normalizing anti-Semitism. So it does require a tremendous amount of vigilance on the part of school boards and school district administrators, because you're right, you're not contracting with Dale Allender to have him give you a curriculum, but you are contracting with him
to do professional development for the teachers. And we know from Liberated Ethnic Studies, for example, who's contracted with Castro Valley, what are they going to be training the teachers to write a curriculum in? They're going to be training them to write a liberated type curriculum. So the ability of public oversight is really reliant upon school board members who need to be aware of and look out for issues such as this. Because Liberated is not going to come to you and say, hey, check out our Teach Palestine pages. They took those down because people who were aligned with them, in particular the deputy superintendent in Castro Valley, suggested to them that it wasn't really a good idea for public relations to have it be so visible for them, okay? And, a lot of this is going to happen behind closed doors, and everybody here is going to rely on the school board and the school district to ensure that there is not going to be anti-Semitic content that comes in.
There's not going to be anti-Semitic content, and we don't do anything behind closed doors. We have the Valley Unified School District.
Is the meeting open tomorrow night for?
It's open. You can come in person, you can go on Zoom. And, you can go on our agendas and attachments are online.
Thank you. We have a question here and a question there, and I'm going to go back here first.
Thank you. Does Stand By Us have any proactive programs with the students in high school? Where they're organizing within the school?
Yeah, Stand With Us does indeed have programs. We're limited by the fact that, of course, you look at the great number of, public schools that there are, but what Stand With Us has is a program of high school interns. It's an application process, it's a competitive process, and the students get to go to conferences, and then they put on programs at their schools. But again, as you can imagine, given the large number of schools all over California, the reach that we have with that is, fairly modest. But yes, we do have a program. And unfortunately, and the reason I say unfortunately, we have a middle school program because, again, as you can see from the Liberated Ethnic Studies folks, they want to bring this all the way down to kindergarten. So we now have programs for educators to give them appropriate curricula about Jews and about the Middle East for middle school students.
And I think that's important, but this is many years ago, when I first became president here at the synagogue, I got a call from one of the parents that one of our Jewish kids had been threatened by kids from another one of the high schools here with very anti-Semitic comments and referring to the Holocaust, in which that all the Jews had been burned. And we ended up having several meetings with the principal at the school. The kids were all taken to task for it. And I say that it starts with the parents, because they're going to hear it from the parents. It's going to go down to the kids. So it's not only educating the kids. We need to educate the parents. Dr. Nemko, you have.
Well, not really a question, but a comment to add to what Mike has been saying. The liberated people took down a lot of the really most anti-Semitic curriculum. They also took down the part that specifically said to teachers, you may want to fly under the radar about this.
Yes.
You may want to close your door unless you know you have a very sympathetic administrator. And I think that's terribly concerning, because it's not visible to anyone. And so, yes, we are depending on our school board, and I wonder, are school board members participating in the training sessions that have gone on with teachers and administrators? Or is it going to be presented again and then recommended, and nobody will know? So that worries me.
Well, my other concern is the fact that if we're teaching ethnic studies here in California, we should be teaching about the ethnic groups in California. The Palestinians and the Israelis are not ethnic groups. So I'm really confused how that even gets into a curriculum here in California, or even discussed. It has nothing to do with the four groups that they have identified. Beth? It's just my comments.
And I always appreciate appreciate your comments. Yeah, so, Mike, I'm Beth Painter, I'm on Napa City Council.
Nice to meet you.
And, you know, I know Cindy and our board members on MVUSD are going to stand up and say the right thing, but I think the community really needs to hear it, because these sort of behind closed doors issues, what Barbara just mentioned, are really concerning, you know, and I know that, I really do. I do think that our school board is going to stand up and say this has no place in our school district, but there's a concern there and a fear there. So you're hearing it here. I hope other board members, you know, you can share that with them, that it's real. The concern is absolutely real. The other thing I'm just going to mention really quickly is that on December 19th, we're going to have an event right here, and we're calling it Here I Am. And it's an opportunity to speak out and speak out against anti-Semitism, speak out against hate. It's going to be elected leaders who are going to be here to light a candle, and it's another opportunity to educate the community, excuse me, and to stand up and get these stories told, because I think, you know, the under the radar and the fact that, you know, maybe it was there and people didn't know is what the concern is. So I'm glad that you're here and can hear this, because the concern is real.
Yes, and I was at the one that's put on by the San Francisco JCRC, and I was at the one that we had in Marin back in April. And one thing also that I think you know, is worth mentioning, and actually this would be, you know, great to make sure, as you said, you know, nothing behind closed doors. Everybody should be aware that there is something called the California Public Records Act that allows any citizen to obtain from any governing body records, not confidential stuff, not personnel things, payroll, you know, none of that stuff, but things that are of public interest, okay? And one of the ways that we've been able to find what's going on with liberated ethnic studies is through Public Records Act. Now, I had one school district, parents I was working with on the peninsula, where they filed actually the Public Records Act request to view the ethnic studies curriculum, and the school district would not allow it. They only allowed one parent whose child was going to be taking that class this fall to come in and view it in the office, but not to have it emailed or make copies or anything else. So in the spirit of transparency, I hope that you will, if people in the community want to see the Ethnic Studies course, that the school district will respect a Public Records Act request and will make it available to anybody in the community.
So I think Cindy and I can guarantee that we will make that available. I think Cindy and I can make sure that that is available for viewing. We do have a period where we will ask for public input. Mm-hmm. We started last year already with the public input, and I've actually connected a couple of groups down in American Canyon with our secondary instruction to have a voice in all of this planning, because it really needs to start in planning, right? We don't want it in there and then have to take it out, because why should it be in there in the first place? So that's my view. And the other thing is, when I first joined the school board 2 years ago, I asked, and at that time it was the height of the anti-Asian issues that was happening, and I really thought very strongly that it really shouldn't just be limited to anti-Asian hate. It really should be anti-racism, and just anti-hate in general. So that's one thing that I planned, and nobody else knows this, because, you know, we think about things for our communities. And I'm planning to bring that to the school board to ask for a revised resolution on this, because that needs to be in the conversation.
Yes.
Right? And it doesn't even matter who it is, we just are anti-hate. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think that's where our baseline should be.
Great. And the ADL also has very, very good resources, because the ADL does not stand only against anti-Semitism, but about hate directed against any group, and they have many, many good resources for schools to help with that.
Thank you for being here. My question is, do you have a feel for the national example from California. I'm not articulating well, but what's going on nationally in terms of ethnic studies and the hate groups who are trying to push their agenda and everything else.
Right. Liberated Ethnic Studies, as you can see, from that Coalition for, Liberated Ethnic Studies slide, national group, they are definitely making inroads in a number of states. The most specifically concerning ones are Washington, Oregon, Minnesota, Vermont. Those are the ones that really stand out as ones that are ahead. But California, absolutely, as in many things, is ahead of the curve on this. So they are really using California as a proving ground to see what they are able to get in. So we're first. The others are following, but Washington State is fairly close behind on this, and they have a group that is extremely radical called Washington Ethnic Studies now that is very involved in their state-level ethnic studies programs.
Are there any further questions? I'm going to turn this mic over to Rabbi, and the reason I am moderating is Rabbi has really bad laryngitis. Yeah. So I appreciate the opportunity to ask these questions. I've been working on this issue now for almost a year, and have been meeting with groups like the ADL and others, and I so appreciate your time. So I'm going to turn this over to Rabbi.
Thank you, Ellen. I'll do my best. Michael, thank you so much for coming. I know those who know me realize I don't always sound like this. But I wanted to personally thank you for coming here tonight.
My pleasure.
This was very informative, provocative, and concerning. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot to do. You're welcome anytime. And if I remember our conversation correctly, you've retired and moved to Bodega Bay?
Correct.
So I don't know if you like wine.
Yes.
I hope you do. But we are Congregation Beth Shalom of Napa Valley. So we didn't want you to leave here without a bottle of Napa Valley wine.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you. Much appreciated.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Good night.
And I'll stick around. I don't have a deadline. I'm happy to talk with you.